Welcome back to Teaching World History using the World History Workbook. I'm David Hertzel. Today we're looking at Chapter 6, The Individual and the Institution in History, which is pages 119 through 139. I won't get to all of that in this one video. Instead, I'll do an introduction. I'll speak a little bit about the first two projects. There are several readings in the back. This chapter includes a lot of reading for this class. Most of the reading is in the appendix. There's a selection from Martin Luther King Nobel Prize acceptance speech from the 1960s that students will need to find online. Otherwise, everything is provided. The basic premise of this chapter is that people have a responsibility, that people are historical actors, people are historical participants. And the principle around which this is organized is this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, just one line, and then later they'll look up the whole thing, on page 1, quoted on page 120 in the second paragraph. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I think I take this chapter very seriously because this is a chapter that really draws the student in, or if you're the student, draws you in. But it also draws in the instructor or the professor, because I am also a participant. I am also a small person in the world, and subject to institutions and laws and traditions and customs. But I also have a conscience, and so do my students. They can also tell justice from injustice most of the time. I understand there's gray areas and there's dispute and there are cultural biases and so on. But the individual does play an important role. Sometimes in opposition to institutions, sometimes as a participant in institutions. There are numerous famous examples of participants who went along as mute functionaries in civilizations and societies that were committing horrible acts. And I'm not suggesting that everybody should risk their lives and their families to intercede, but I think that it's important for students to be thoughtful about this, respectful about this subject, and to acknowledge that students also aren't mere flotsam and jetsam, but they are also able to influence the world around them. And I think this is empowering for a lot of young people to realize that the way they treat themselves, and their surroundings and their neighbors and their classmates and their families and their professors and a stranger on the street, the way they respond to injustice, the way they respond to situations, the way they interact with institutions, the way they speak their mind, those have influence. Those are important things. That these big movements begin with small movements, and I think it's important and significant that some of the people that are identified in these readings, the first two in particular, were at one time minor people. They were minor figures. I mean, Gandhi makes it clear that there was one point at which he says nobody in India agreed with him on his mission. Nobody agreed with him. Think of what Martin Luther King faced when he would visit the families of victims of racist violence. He was a small person. The vast majority of people sort of assumed an ethic of retribution, of vengeance, of violence for violence, and he chose not to. And he was in a minority. He was a minority within a minority. Even he eventually got a following, just like Gandhi did, and eventually was able to assert a lot of influence. But that didn't begin one day where he walked in and he had a welcoming, warm, receptive crowd. Gandhi certainly not. Gandhi spoke to to groups where people were screaming at him that he was a fool and he couldn't surrender, and how can you respond to violence with peace. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, that he was correct or incorrect. What I'm saying is that these people challenged the institutional thinking, that they as individuals followed a different set of principles based on their reading of right and wrong. And clearly, I think peace is superior to war, although it may not always be possible. So the individual and the institution in history is one way to make world history the student's history. And this is, unfortunately, I think, this is a little unique in this way. This class is unique in this way. This textbook is unique in this way. I've never understood why this isn't a theme that's celebrated and promoted and introduced and opened for discussion in more, the larger textbook encyclopedic models of world history. Because if it's world history, then it's my history. If it's world history, then it's my student's history, whether my student is a Cheyenne student or a Mennonite student or an African-American student or a white student or a female or I mean, that's all, the world history. They're part of the world, are they not? Is the world belongs to them, and they're young, and so it does belong to them in the future. And so I think that I think it's really important in this class. This is one of the things that I think is it's one of the beauties of GE classes, is that it brings in a lot of people, many of whom are young and have come out of high school. A lot of those people don't feel particularly empowered in the flow of history. But here Martin Luther King says, actually, they have influence. And I think that's clear, that's demonstrable, that's historical. So the first example here is on page 120. It's a short excerpt from a story about a colonel who intended to assault a convent, but then decided not to. The message being that he is a mid-level military officer. He wasn't a great man in battles. He wasn't a great leader. He led a contingency of troops. He had the decision to make: should I storm this convent or not? He intended to. And if he'd ordered his troops to, apparently they would have gone with him, and they would have brutalized the residents, and they would have stolen all of their things, and who knows what else they would have done, what horrors they would have committed. But during the night, he had on the night before the planned attack, he had a conscience attack. His conscience told him, this is wrong. Who do you think you are to do this? Now, the story reads that the gods of the convent, the gods protecting the convent, that could be his conscience. It could be they spoke through his conscience. It could be they spoke to him and his conscience listened. But in any case, he listened and he chose not to do that. Well, that's a historical event. Maybe not the gods. His conscience is a psychological historical event, but it's a historical event. And he's a minor character. Were it not for this story, I think nobody would have heard of him, and the story is not famous either. Second example, I think, is better known, particularly among Cajun and Acadian people, and this is of Colonel Winslow, who delivered the message from the King of England that the Acadian people needed to leave. Okay, this has been your home, your farms, your families. You all need to leave now. And he gave this really kind of shocking statement that's provided, very brief, provided on pages 121 and 122, about how he felt about that as a human being on the one hand, and this is how he refers to himself. The same human beings as those who he was about to expel, and he knew it would cause great suffering, and it caused enormous suffering. People died. People went hungry. People lost their homes. And yet he went through with it because he had the order, and obviously, apparently, if he hadn't done it, then the next person down the chain of command would have done it. It would have happened either way. Interestingly, I've spoken with a number of people who live in modern Acadia in Nova Scotia, and they say that his reputation among the Acadian people is really not bad. It's not as terrible as one might think. That they kind of understood he had to do this, but they actually received some comfort from his statement. They felt like everybody recognized that this was wrong, and this didn't save any lives, but it was some small measure of comfort. So the project on page 123 is Project 24, the moral dilemmas of the son and the colonel. And the questions relate to those two brief readings, which are both included in the text. How do the two stories suggest an individual of apparently minor position in society might still have opportunities to make an impact on the world around him or her that can have historical consequences? I think it seems clear the intent of this question is to show that every student is also in a position, whether they work at a grocery store, or they work at a drugstore, or they work at the cafeteria, or they simply live in the dorms and study. They also have responsibility, and they also have influence. And the second question: how does the story of Yeh-hu relate a Confucian ethic? The Confucian ethic would have something to do with harmony, with the path, with respect, with benevolence, with all of those things that Confucius describes in The Mandate of Heaven and the Doctrine of the Mean, which we have already spoken about. The next set, these people obviously are very famous: Jesus, Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. And there's a contrast set up on page 125 between Kipling and Gandhi. They both lived in the India of the British Empire, and they had very different perspectives of the world around them, of what they saw. Very different ideas about the people, about the culture, about the friction and the tension between the British and the native people of South Asia. So the project, these people are in similar positions: Jesus, Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Similar to the colonel and the colonel, in that they faced institutional evil, institutional or institutionalized evil, prejudice, hatred, violence, and they spoke out. They spoke out against it. And one question this raises is, how did they know? How did they know that that was evil? That the goings-on were evil? The first question on the project: describe in your own words what the four texts share. And I mean, there are a number of ways to approach that. They generally share a promotion of nonviolence, but they share more than that, and they are part of an intellectual history, part of an intellectual cycle, beginning with Jesus, followed with Tolstoy and Gandhi, who actually corresponded, although I wouldn't say that either one was an enormous influence on the other. They were influences. And Martin Luther King. And of course Gandhi and Jesus were enormous influences on Martin Luther King Jr. The second question is, what are the specific historical complaints of Tolstoy's critics? One needs to read the Tolstoy pretty carefully to see that, and then to take his word for it. But his description of their complaints, I think, is historically fair. Number three, on what principle did these four reformers challenge prevailing institutional thinking? In other words, what gave them the authority? What gave them the right? There's a really remarkable coincidence of historical documents that is the reading for Project 26. And I usually do these. Each of these projects gets its own day, its own discussion, its own time for writing answers. So this chapter takes several days, sometimes more. The Project 26 looks at two readings that are provided in the back, in the appendix of this book. One from a missionary to Japan, an American missionary from Japan, a Christian missionary, and the other from a scientist who has gone to Japan to conduct an experiment. Really, a very impressive person and a fascinating experiment. They are visiting Japan almost at the same time. They're visiting the same place. They see the same rituals. They see the same, the same types of people and the same types of activities, if not the same people. When I read the second of these for the first time, I thought, oh my gosh, this person is going to describe that other person that I just read, who also visited Japan and climbed Mount Fuji with these pilgrims. It's really it's kind of a rare historical opportunity. Here are two people from different perspectives, one a scientist, one a missionary. One is in Japan to convert, the other is in Japan simply to do objective research, and doesn't really have a bias or a prejudice one way or the other about the Japanese people until the end. Then he sort of develops a real liking for this man at the temple. But they have different ways to describe. They use different language. They have different perceptions. They have different perspectives of the Japanese people, of the Japanese culture, of the pilgrimages, of the pilgrims themselves. And it's a very interesting contrast. That's very interesting contrast. So the project is to read these two selections from the appendix and then answer these questions. Do the missionary and scientists describe similar physical settings and activities? And I think the answer is generally yes, they do. They describe essentially the same activity, and one could be used to confirm the historical authenticity of the other. I think that's important to establish at the beginning. Question 2, how might these individual encounters be historically significant as encounters between social systems, mentalities, and civilizations? This, I think, is also important. It's not the lesson that might jump out at the beginning, but it's an important lesson that for many of those pilgrims, Japanese pilgrims who were climbing Mount Fuji, one or the other of these people may be the only non-Japanese person that they see in their entire lives, and certainly more likely the only American person that they see, and maybe the only American scientist, the only American missionary. So those people may come to represent, for some of the Japanese people, those two individuals may come to represent those entire cultures, or those people, or those civilizations, or those ideas, or Christianity, or white people, or they represent something much larger. And the reverse is a little bit broader, but it's also not untrue. The scientist didn't live there for years, and I don't believe the missionary did either. The missionary came back to the United States to write her recollections, her travel log, and so on. But their impressions are also shaped by these few encounters that they had. Maybe it was hundreds. Maybe there were altogether hundreds of pilgrims and hundreds of people migrating or going up the hill, going up the mountain. But that's still obviously a small selection of the population of Japan, and geographically and culturally. So that's an interesting thing, because it reflects again back to students' own lives. A student may come to represent for other people, and for international students, I think this was automatic, and they were already aware of it. That many of the Americans they meet will have never before met somebody from Zambia. You may be the only Zambian that many Americans ever meet. So what you do will have a great influence over the way that some people will think of Zambia, and maybe of Africa. That was true then. It's still true today, although less true today, I think. And number 3, describe the encounter between the priest and the scientist. Is their exchange respectful? Why does the scientist suppose liberal-minded as a positive attribute. This is the real unhidden message, is to contrast these two experiences. First, to establish how they're similar, and then to contrast how they are different. I think I'll close there, so that Hashim Agajari from Project 27 gets his own discussion, which he clearly deserves. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye.